Thanks for joining, everybody. My name is Jason Shake. I'm the training and implementations specialist here at Sassafras, and we're going to talk today about user roles and limited access accounts within the KeyServer. So every KeyServer has a primary purpose, whether that is active license management, usage tracking and reporting, lab maps, or something else. The main administrator has the ability to perform any task and access any record. In most organizations, though, there are others who may need to make decisions based on the information that's collected and stored and can be reported on by the KeyServer. And rather than needing to go through the main admin all the time to run reports and things, sometimes it makes sense to give these users direct access, whether through the administrative console Key Configure or the web-based portal Key Reporter, or both. But that doesn't mean that every user that has any kind of access to the KeyServer should have an account with full administrative rights and privileges. So the primary KeyServer administrator actually has the ability to create limited access accounts for these other users, allowing them to run reports, enter purchases, create maps, or make configuration changes that are restricted to their section or limited by the access that they have been given. So today we're going to talk about how you as the primary KeyServer administrator can manage these limited access accounts. And we're going to try to unpack some of the complexity that can arise around accounts, roles, and groups. And we'll also talk about some of the ways that those three things fit together to allow specific users access to just the components of the KeyServer that you've provided them access to. So let's just take a quick look at the outline here, and then we will jump into KeyServer. So the first thing we'll look at is the admin access window itself. This is where roles, groups, and accounts are managed. The second thing we'll look at is the difference between permissions and scope, and what the difference is within the KeyServer between roles, which grant permissions, and access control lists, which are often managed by groups, but not always. We'll dig into specifics about what the differences are between accounts, roles, groups within KeyServer, and also talk about the differences between groups as associated with administrative accounts versus Active Directory groups and other groups that we find in the KeyServer. And we'll talk about some of the built-in roles and ways that permissions can be granted within the KeyServer. And then we'll look at scope, access control lists, groups, and then at the end, we'll take a step back and think about how this all can be applied by using user groups in Active Directory. All right, so you have on your screen a view of a KeyServer that's locally installed on my machine using real customer data that has been anonymized. Under the window menu, you can go down to admin access, and that will bring this window up. And you'll see this window is broken into three sections. At the top are roles, and in the middle are groups, and at the bottom are actual accounts. So every user of the KeyServer will need to be assigned an account or be given credentials for an account within that KeyServer, and then that account will need to be given both permissions through a role and access or a scope for those permissions, often with a group, but not always. And we'll talk about the different ways that scope can be defined. So accounts, like I said, that represents a person. A person gets an account, that account has a password, and that will allow them to log into the KeyServer. But they're not going to see anything when they get there. Because an account with a password, whether that is authenticated by a password assigned within KeyServer or authenticated through Active Directory, the ability to log in does not grant permission to do or see anything. And the only way to get permissions within the KeyServer is through a role. So we have a number of roles built in, and the main two are the most powerful two rather, are the administrator role and the enterprise manager role. Administrator role actually the enterprise manager role as well, don't have to worry about scope. They are scoped right into the ACLs at the server root level and have complete access to all objects within the KeyServer in terms of their scope. Their role, which is, they are defined as a role, also has a very broad base. The administrator role itself cannot be deleted, it cannot be edited, it cannot be incorporated with accounts that are coming in from Active Directory. It has to be manually set up with a password, and it sort of can't be modified. Enterprise manager role can do almost everything the administrator can do, but it cannot do things that are KeyServer level settings. So making adjustments to the KeyServer itself as opposed to the objects within the KeyServer. Just to take a quick step back here, each of these roles, if we go into one of these roles, you'll see that permissions are assigned by these dropdowns. And the different roles were in the enterprise manager role here, and you can see that there are some activities that the enterprise manager role does not have permission to do. Under account privileges, very few settings changes. So the enterprise manager is going to be managing policies which are associated with programs and products and computer records. They can go in and manipulate the KeyServer data, but they cannot manipulate the KeyServer itself. So that's a role, and each of these roles has a note. Each of the built-in roles has a note that defines exactly what it is and what it's for. So this is a good way to try to get an idea of, when you're assigning a role to a new user, exactly what role they might use, if you can use a built-in one, or whether you need to create a custom role on your own. So now that user has logged in, they've been given a role, they can't see anything. And the reason they can't see anything is because a role may be sufficient to give you permission to do something, but it doesn't actually grant you any rights to do it. And the way we typically try to describe this is it's similar to the way your driver's license gives you permission to drive, but you don't have the right to drive any vehicle you want. You've got to have the keys to a specific vehicle or a specific set of vehicles. And the different roles, you could say, are different types of driver's license, or the ability or the permission to drive motorcycles or commercial vehicles. There are many different roles you might be able to fill, but your specific role is granted to you by the scope of your rights, of what you're allowed to do, where you're allowed to do it. So a role defines what you can do, and the scope defines where you can do it or what objects you can take action on. So, like I said, roles are the only way you can get permissions. In general, in terms of best practices, with the exception of the administrator role and the enterprise manager role, any other user that's been assigned any other role, best practice is to assign a scope by using a group. And groups are actually here for one purpose, which is to make it easier and simpler to manage your ACLs or access control lists and provide a scope to users. The place where things can get confusing is that groups are not the only way to manage access control lists. You can get onto ACLs through roles, and then you can even put individual accounts into ACLs. And every object in the KeyServer has an ACL. So you can see where this can very quickly get extremely complex, especially if you're looking to do a very fine-tuned custom scope for an end user. It's not impossible, but we hope that for the most part, using the built-in groups and roles, that's going to cover 95 to 99% of the cases, and the one you're going to choose most often if you're not dealing with computer sections, which are what east, north, west are here, the thing you're going to primarily choose is probably going to be the editors group. You can go into that and kind of see what the definition of that is. Just like the roles, the built-in groups have definitions. And what you're going to see is that when we go into the ACL windows, those access control lists, what you will see is you're primarily going to want to think about groups as scope and roles as permission. You can also grant scope rights with accounts directly or with roles as well. So just for a quick look at something like that, we're going to go to the config menu and down to edit server ACL. And this server ACL window shows you what objects, either accounts, roles, or groups, have access to the server and with what degree. So viewers have the ability to view any object within the key server, but that's it. Enterprise manager is a role, administrator is a role. If you've been assigned either of those roles, you don't need to be in a group, but editors is a group. So if you want users to actually be able to access any object within the key server, drive any car on the street, then you would give them this group. They do not have the ability to grant, so they cannot make adjustments to other people's ACLs. But otherwise, they do have the ability to do pretty much anything an administrator would do, except that they are restricted by their permissions. So what could be a complex thing is made simpler by a pre-built group that allows you to do that. Now, before we go on, I want to take a minute to talk about groups, because that word, as I said, is used even within KeyServer in multiple places, and it means different things depending on where you are. An Active Directory group actually is probably the closest to this kind of group. You can see at the top of this window, you have the ability to put in an external group name. That's exactly where you would put your Active Directory group name. So Active Directory groups can map to groups in KeyServer, but they're not restricted that way. You can also assign an Active Directory group to a role separately. So Active Directory groups and KeyServer groups can map to one another, but they're not the same exact thing. Another place where KeyServer groups are used are under the Windows menu. We have a groups window. So here are groups in the KeyServer that have nothing to do with administrative access. These groups are computer groups, and they have to do with policies and software management. So we're really restricting ourselves to this one specific location within the KeyServer, admin access, as where we're talking about administrative groups. So if we walk through the process now of setting up a new account and checking to make sure we're doing everything correctly, you can see there's some accounts down here. I can right click and create a new account. And so we can assign this name. This will be Bob James. And I'm just going to leave everything the way it is currently as far as the settings are concerned. What I'm going to do, though, is give this guy a role immediately. So now the Bob James account will be created, and he will immediately be given this role of tech. So Command S to save that. And we've got our new account in the KeyServer that has a role. Now, if we were to log off and attempt to log on with this, we're not going to see anything because this account has no access. It's not been added to any access control list. But what I can do is go into the editors group and add this user to that group. And now Bob is going to inherit all of the rights of that editors group. So that's probably the most straightforward use. I brought in an account, I assigned it a role, and I added the account to a group. And you'll notice there are a couple of other groups that are in this KeyServer, the North managers, East managers, and West managers. You don't have to do anything to create groups that are associated with sections. Actually, this whole groups concept was brought into KeyServer to make the process of adding a section administrator as simple as possible. The moment you create a new section by right-clicking over in this computers window and selecting new section, assigning it a name, that is going to create a new group with the name of that section. So that creates a group that's very easy, in fact, pretty much automatic if you then have an account that you want to turn into a West manager or an East manager. So we'll go back into Bob James here, and we're going to actually add a role, and we're going to make him a section manager. What he needs is a section though. So now he's been assigned a role. That's his permission. He has permission to be a section manager, but he's not been assigned to any section. So if I say, okay, we're going to make him an East section manager, and then save this, immediately he got added to the East managers group. So when you're dealing with sections and new users, all you really need to do is create the section, and then your group is going to be there and assign that section manager role and a default section, and you're done. So that was the original reason that groups were created. Later on, this editors group was added to make it easier for those custom situations where you want to primarily handle permissions and otherwise grant an open scope. And then again, beyond that, you can create your own custom group and go into the individual ACLs throughout the KeyServer to kind of figure out exactly what permissions you want to provide. So we close this down and just have a look. We went in to the server ACL before here under the config menu, but I can right click on any of these divisions individually and see that there's an ACL here. So theoretically, I could create a new group that was a division manager and bring that group into this division's ACL and give someone, and then add someone to that group and give them only permission to see one division of computers. The sections themselves, if you double click those, right clicking doesn't do it, but you can see here there's a section ACL. So there's the ACL for the section, and you can see the East managers has automatically been added to that. If we come down to purchases, oh, we got to go where the folders are, edit ACL. So there's purchases ACL. The main one of these windows where you're not going to see access control lists as an option is the products window. You can't restrict view of products per se in the KeyServer. They're not restricted. That doesn't mean they don't technically have an ACL. It just means that access to modify that is not available in the UI, and everyone is allowed product information. So you can imagine many uses and many custom ways of building accounts here for various users within your organization, whether that be a lab manager or a department or campus-wide manager if you've got multiple campuses. You have student workers that might just be building lab maps for the computer and software availability maps. For purchasing, procurement, you might want to have an account for someone who's going to go in and enter purchase information and maybe run a few reports, usage reports, but not see computers. All that is definitely possible. And this example we stepped through here was creating an account manually and manually adding those groups and things. So let's just take a second and talk about how you might incorporate accounts from a group in Active Directory. So the first step is for the accounts themselves to exist. If you're going to allow someone in, the first thing you got to do is be able to authenticate. So instead of right-clicking and doing anything within this window, we're actually going to come back to this config dropdown and go to admin authentication. So client authentication is about managing your divisions through Active Directory integration, and admin authentication is about allowing users to log in using Active Directory credentials. If we go into admin authentication, this is what the window looks like. I'm on a Mac, so I don't see AD as an option. If the KeyServer was on a Windows machine, I would see that as an option, AD, and I could just select AD and click OK. 90% of the time, that's all you need to do, because that just tells KeyServer refer logins to the AD on the domain. If the AD is not accessible to the KeyServer, then that's when you might have to start entering in some information so it can find it. But otherwise, selecting AD and clicking OK is all you've got to do. Now, when you do that, you're not going to immediately start to see accounts show up here. KeyServer is not going out and asking Active Directory about all of its accounts, so you don't have to worry about a flood of accounts you don't want showing up. The only time an account is going to be brought into the KeyServer and that information displayed here is when a user actually tries to log in. So the user attempts to log in using their Active Directory credentials from either Key Reporter or KeyServer. That's when you're going to see their name show up. But unless you've given them a role or permission and a scope, usually through a group, they're not going to see anything when they get in here. And you can see who they were and delete their account when you see it, because it will show up here. So you can try this out, or you can confirm that it worked by attempting to sign into Key Configure using your Active Directory credentials. At that point, you'll see your name show up. And you can manage these accounts individually when they start showing up, wait for a user to log in, and then assign them a role and add them to a group. Or you can actually go into the role you want to assign, let's say Help Desk, and put the name of that Active Directory group in this external group window, or LDAP group in this external group window. That means that when a user logs in, they're automatically going to be assigned this role if they're a part of that AD group. And then similarly, let's say you want to use the editors group for managing ACLs, you can just simply put this very same group AD group name here in the external group, and that's going to give them that scope, whatever the scope that you're assigning. That really is pretty much all there is to the Active Directory integration for admin access accounts in most situations. You just turn on Active Directory and then add the group name to the role and the group that you would like to provide permissions to, and then whoever logs in, the first time they log in, they're going to be assigned that role and given that scope.